Oh, crap. Was this it? Was he going to find me stuck here like a tin of sardines and end me on sight? Or would he punish me like Craig for my disobedience? Terror filled me, and it took everything I had to remain calm and steady my breathing. The lift was pretty hard to see in its obscured location, and only a few inches of me were visible. Maybe he wouldn't see me. The thought seemed a bit delusional, but it was all I could do to keep from melting down. Oh no, the pipe! I hadn't been able to fit it into the lift with me, and it was laying clearly against the wall below me. If he spotted that, there was no way out of this. Panic rose in me, but there was no time to do anything. Sure enough, the door to the morgue could be heard creaking open. My face went numb as I heard heavy footsteps click across the tiles of the morgue. He was getting closer. I held my breath. If he got much closer, he would see the pipe for sure. Tears welled up in my eyes as the footsteps drew nearer and nearer. But suddenly, they halted. Another sound met my ears. Screaming, loud and clear, and also the sound of thrashing and some crashes. It seemed once again Craig's sacrifice would be my savior. At the sounds of mayhem echoing down the hall, Locklear turned on his heel and sprinted with astounding speed out of the morgue and down the hall, not even bothering to close the door behind him. Just moments later, I heard more shouting and a loud struggle. This was my chance. Using every ounce of strength I had, I lifted myself inside the cramped elevator and let my torso fall back onto the bottom of the lift. Surprisingly, it seemed to work. The lift recoiled, then dropped me back down the short distance to the bottom of the shaft. The crash was loud and hurt my back quite a bit after the initial impact, but amazingly, the struggle was still going on down the corridor, and it seemed to have completely masked my own commotion down here. Rubbing my sore back and gathering the bent pipe once more, I reevaluated my situation. This end of the corridor was not going to be my way out, so my only other option was to try my luck down on the side where Locklear had run off to. I knew it was risky, but perhaps if I could sneak up and get a good look at the layout ahead, I might be able to sneak out of there while he was preoccupied. Calming my breath and focusing on being as quiet as possible, I proceeded back out into the long hallway. I passed the dark room where I had started out to the left and willed myself to keep pushing on. I could still hear Locklear ahead somewhere at the end of the corridor, but the commotion had clearly died down. It was apparent that he had handled the situation and was back to doing whatever vile things I had interrupted him from previously. My breath caught in my throat as I spotted another door to the right. Perhaps I wouldn't have to chance it after all. With a shaky hand, I pulled open the door and quickly slipped in, thanking the stars that it didn't creak. However, within seconds of entering the room, I regretted it. The overpowering scent of blood nearly triggered my gag reflex. If the morgue was bad, this was infinitely worse. Unlike the clean and well-lit hallway, this room was dim, much like the first room, which only added more dread to the oppressive atmosphere it bore. In the center of the room stood a large metal table, and around it, many tables of vicious-looking tools and strange fluids. Beneath the center table was a filthy drain on the floor. My eyes continued to scan the room. Saw blades, chemicals, many horrifying sights. It was apparent that I had stumbled across the room, which Locklear used to dispose of his victims when his work was done. Well, at least those victims that he didn't intentionally leave out elsewhere to make a statement. There were no doors or windows in this room, just horrors and the overwhelming smell of death and blood. My pulse raced as I spun on my heels and fled back into the corridor, sealing the horrific death chamber behind me. That's it then. My only shot is past Locklear. I stood silent for a moment, mentally preparing myself for what was to come next. But my concentration was broken by a truly sickening sound. There was a grotesque, wet crunch, followed by Craig's howls of agony, and then a strange hissing, followed by more screaming. Another crunch and hiss, more screams, another, and so on, and so on. I nearly vomited on the spot, but I had to control myself. Finally, the cacophony of crunches and screams quieted. It had been interrupted by a strange sound. I recognized it almost immediately as a cell phone ringing. But who? Suddenly, the silence was broken by Locklear speaking. Wait, who would he be talking to? My terror took backseat to my curiosity, and I willed myself further down the hall. He was definitely on the phone with someone.
Oh, of course not. What could have given you that idea? Hold on a moment. I can't get reception with a dam down here. I'm gonna have to head upstairs. Just give me a moment.
The sound of footsteps, followed by the creak of an old metal door, met my ears. Finally willing myself to peek through the small window in the door, closing off the room from the rest of the corridor, I spotted him climbing into an old cargo-style elevator and then ascend to the floor above, out of sight. A few more moments passed and I heard the sound of footsteps creaking across the floor above me, accompanied by the very faint and muffled continuation of his phone call. What was that? Who was he talking to? And why did he sound so evasive, like he was trying to hide something? These questions plagued my mind, but now was not the time to linger on them. With determination, I seized the opportunity and pushed through the door. While not grotesque like the disposal room further down the hall, this room chilled my blood far more than anything else I had yet seen. Aside from the scent of blood, it smelled overwhelmingly sterile. It looked that way too. Harsh LED lights lit the spotless white room, and I realized I was in a sort of operating theater. And there at the center, hanging weakly onto life, was Craig. I nearly averted my eyes and passed him by quickly for the elevator, but considering all he had done for me, consciously or not, I owed him my life. So I veered over to the table and was met by a stomach-churning sight. It was suddenly apparent what those crunches and hisses I had previously heard had been. Craig lay still, clearly unconscious from pain and shock at this point. Where his hands and feet had once connected to wrists and ankles lay only bloody stumps. But they looked darker and congealed. I looked to the left and saw more vicious tools, a large, bloody pair of bone shears, and a cauterizing iron. The twisted monster had been dismembering poor Craig, but clearly still wanted him alive, as the freshly cauterized wounds prevented him from bleeding out. The dotted pen marks littering his body told me Locklear had dark plans for this man's internal organs. Clearly he wanted him alive as long as possible. That twisted sicko! Suddenly, the silence was broken by a weak, tormented sound. It was Craig. He had regained consciousness and detected me. He very weakly called out to me. At this point, I also noticed the bloody bandages on his all too hollow-looking eye sockets, and only imagined what he had previously endured.
Please kill me.
It was all his vocal cords, hoarse from screaming, could manage. My body went cold. The thought sickened me, but I realized in this moment there was nothing I could possibly do to save him. And considering what he'd already been through, a quick death would be an absolute mercy. Not to mention, If Locklear wanted him alive to preserve his organs, killing Craig now would ruin whatever plans he had for them. A wave of cold resolve washed over me, and I picked up a blade from the tray of sharp instruments. Steadily as I could, I drove the blade into his jugular and slashed it ear to ear. I immediately dropped the blade and let out a traumatized sob. But when I looked back up to Craig, a weak smile splashed across his face, and he mouthed the words, "Thank you," before growing still. I could have stayed there for hours, weeping and trying to make peace with what I had just done to the man who had saved my life. But time was not a luxury I could afford at that moment. I didn't know how long Locklear would be distracted by his phone call, and I had already used up so much of my precious time. Hardening my resolve, I whispered my soft goodbyes to Craig and hurried over to the elevator. It was still upstairs, so I was going to have to call it back down here. When Locklear had taken it up, it hadn't made much noise. It was clearly better maintained than the mini lift in the morgue. However, I wasn't sure how far away from it he was now, and if he'd hear me arriving. Trading out my bent pipe for one of the viciously sharp knives on the tray near the elevator, I reached out and hit the call button before I could talk myself out of it. To my great relief, once again, it glided smoothly down the shaft, hardly making a sound until the metal door opened. Clutching my knife, I stepped in and pressed the button once more, this time feeling myself lurch upward. It wasn't a long ride, only up one floor, and before I had time to prepare, the metal door was sliding open to reveal another door, this time wooden and old-fashioned. I held my breath and pushed this door open, revealing what appeared to be the sitting room of an old-fashioned home. It seemed I was in some kind of old-fashioned funeral house, perhaps, the kind that had the mortuary below and the undertaker and his family lived above. Either that or a farmhouse with a slaughter room below, but my money was on being a funeral home. I stood in shaky silence for a moment, scanning my surroundings. Locklear was nowhere to be seen, but I could still hear his voice drifting from somewhere else in the home. He was still fully engulfed in his phone call, allowing me precious time to search for a way out. The room I was in was surprisingly cozy for a murder den. Sure, it could do with a bit of dusting, but it had that wonderful old charm. A soft light filtered through a massive bay window, so it was still daytime. I took a few steps over to peer outside. There were no signs of the city, just a seemingly endless stretch of sprawling fields of acreage accompanied by a lone dirt road winding through. I knew we couldn't be too far away from the city since he had gotten me here at what I assumed to be a timely matter, but we were definitely well beyond the city limits. Clearly out somewhere where stretches of private property and farmland still existed. Not wanting to dawdle, I ripped my view away from the freedom just beyond my grasp. There didn't appear to be a way for me to open that window, and there was no external doors in sight. I would have to keep moving. And so, with measured steps, I slowly and quietly moved further through the home. I passed a formal dining room that looked like it hadn't been used in ages. Hanging on the wall were dusty photos of people I didn't recognize, though something strange did catch my eye. Though not sharing the same sculpted cheekbones or long raven hair, one of the men in the photo bore a striking resemblance to Locklear. Could it be possible that this was a family home at some point? Could one of them possibly be who he was talking to on the phone? My attention immediately snapped elsewhere, however, as I spotted a door that looked as though it led out to the property behind the house. Excitedly, I sped up my pace and reached for the door. A small, flashing red light caught my eye. Above the door was a clearly armed security system that would no doubt start wailing the moment I attempted to open the door. And he was just way too close. Yes, I could have still tried to run for it, but I knew the odds and how foolish that would have been. How the heck would anyone expect a 5'6", admittedly out-of-shape lady such as myself to outrun a 6.5-foot walking wall of lean muscle? There was a lot of acreage out there to cover if I wanted to make it to safety, so if I wanted any prayer of making it out of here, I'd need as much of a head start before he noticed I was missing as possible. Turning back to the hallway I had come from, I slowly continued working through the home. I passed a large staircase on the right, but paid it no mind. I highly doubted an old home like this would have a convenient fire escape for ease of absconding. As I continued onward, I passed a kitchen, a chef's pantry, and a water closet, but nowhere any signs of another means of escape. And the further I trekked onward, the louder Locklear's voice became. He was obviously somewhere close now. I froze at the end of the hallway. It opened into a large sitting room and foyer. Sure enough, Locklear was seated in an old sofa, his back turned to me. So far, he hadn't noticed me, so perhaps I had a chance? I gazed over to the foyer, which was through a doorway adjacent to the sitting room. I could see the front door from here. It also had a security system posted above it. But unlike the back door, I couldn't see a red light indicating that it was armed. Perhaps I could hide out, maybe in the water closet in the hallway, until he went back downstairs. Then I could slip out the door to freedom. I decided to linger near the end of the hall for a while, however, as I wanted to keep an eye on him until the last possible moment. I was, admittedly, also rather curious about his ongoing phone call. I was close enough now that I could faintly hear the voice coming in from the other line. It was a woman? And the flirtatious tone Locklear responded with made it clear it was not a relative. But who could it be? Whoever it was, however, didn't sound too pleased with him. I couldn't make out every word, but she was definitely agitated with him. I couldn't help but strain my ear to eavesdrop further.
Well, of course not, silly thing.
Locklear trilled in response to angry ramblings over the receiver.
You should know me better than that by now. I know what the case looks like, but I was not mistaken. She's a real sick piece of work, this one.
I furrowed my brow in confusion. What were they talking about?
I almost let this one fly under my radar too, but I get a feeling about it and decided to dig deeper. And goodness, does the rabbit hole go deep.
The female voice on the other line didn't seem to buy what Locklear had to say, and suddenly my heart skipped a beat when I overheard her say, You need to let her go, Evander. There was nothing tying her to that case. I'm still not 100% on board with everything you do, but I certainly don't think a gut feeling is enough to condemn someone to what it is you do." Her voice trailed off, and there was a brief silence before Locklear spoke again.
Trust me, sweet. It's more than a gut feeling. Miss Winters is an exceedingly sick animal, and if she isn't put down now, the cycle will only continue. This is my duty. To take care of situations that are too uncomfortable for others to accept.
They were talking about me. I know I should have stayed calm and focused, but something about the way he said that. Me? A sick animal? That is rich coming from him. It infuriated me. The woman on the other line responded to him, but I couldn't focus hard enough to make out the words as my blood had begun to boil. I looked down at the razor-sharp blade clutched in my hand. Perhaps better than just escaping, I could also take care of a much larger problem at hand. His back was still turned to me after all, and he was quite preoccupied with the phone call. It would be just like I had done with Craig. Quick, easy, then I could take my time fleeing. Maybe I'd even be dubbed a hero and get featured on the local news. Maybe even the national. Being seen on television had always been a secret desire of mine. But I couldn't let daydreams get ahead of me now. I needed to focus. Hardening my resolve for my new plan, I began to focus on being as silent as possible as I crept up behind Locklear. The progression, however, was quite slow, as it was hard not to get distracted by the conversation now.
Perhaps I'll come by your place later and explain everything, so you can finally understand what I'm talking about.
Locklear suggested. Yeah, I'd prefer if you didn't. the female voice retorted. I crept closer and closer. I was almost exactly where I needed to be to make my move.
See you tonight.
Locklear chirped, clearly ignoring the woman's disinterest.
But I really should run. I've got a little stalker to deal with.
Stalker? Did he just call me a stalker? I don't know what it was about that word, but something about it set me off. I was seeing red. Who was a monster like him calling me a stalker? He didn't even know me. He didn't even know what I have lived through. How I have had my heart broken and been abandoned for no reason. Caring about someone doesn't make you a stalker. Loving someone with your whole heart doesn't make you a stalker, damn it. In my state of rightful fury, I sprung to make my move. I plunged my knife to his throat, aiming to kill. But at the last moment, he snapped his head back to me. He had known I was there. With a lightning-fast reflex, he grabbed my wrist with such crushing force that I had to drop the knife for fear of my hand being broken. A mere second later, I felt my feet lift from the ground and my world spin upside down. He had violently pulled me over the back of the couch and flipped me down onto the ground, my back impacting so hard it knocked the wind out of me. There I was, thinking I had reversed the roles, that I had become the predator now stalking my prey. But I should have known better. Known that I was taking on an apex predator, a killer of killers, and that he had likely been 2 steps ahead of me the whole time. The pipe left within reach of my cage, leaving me in the morgue to deal with a heavily sedated man that probably could do no more than throw himself around on the floor. He likely knew I was there, trapped in the lift, but ran off simply to toy with me and give me false hope. And even now, the front door, he had left it unarmed just for me. Such tasty bait to take me exactly where he wanted me to go. And I fell for it. I could now only lay there on the floor, gasping for breath. The woman on the other end of the line started shouting frantically as the phone had fallen hard onto the floor. Locklear picked it up and briefly barked that he had to go because a situation had arisen, before ending the call and turning back to me. And as if I weighed nothing at all, he slung my form over his shoulder and in the most undignified fashion carried me back to that cursed elevator. I tried to fight back, but it was like trying to pry myself from a bear trap. I was simply overpowered. As the elevator neared the lower level and opened back up to the operating theater, I felt angry tears begin to well up in my eyes. I couldn't physically fight him, but he couldn't stop me from voicing the truth. In the very least, I would have my final rebellion. "You can kill me," I roared in defiance. "But then you'll have to stop the self-righteous act of claiming only to go after violent criminals. I've never done anything wrong and I don't deserve this."
Would you shut up, you psychotic little tart?
Locklear spat back at me. This time, no whimsical sing-song tone in his voice. Only cruelty. With a painful thud, he threw me onto a gurney and, despite my thrashing, strapped me in so tightly my arms burned and I could hardly move a muscle. He hesitated for a moment, spotting my handiwork on Craig. He shoved his gurney to the side and looked at me with an expression that told me I would be paying dearly for interfering with his other work. However, swallowing the building rage growing on his face, he spoke again.
Never done anything wrong. Then what would you describe what you did to Miss Stephanie Lopez? Or should I say, Mr. Gabriel Walker's girlfriend? Ring any bells, Miss Winters?
Sure as the sedative he was now pumping into my arm. The words paralyzed me. How? How could he know about that? It was impossible. Besides, what I did what I had to. There was no other choice. Anyone would have done the same if they were put in that horrible situation. It wasn't fair to blame me. I was the victim in all of this. Finally, unable to restrain myself any further, all of the thoughts that had been burbling around my head for the past month that I had kept to myself in a pressure cooker of emotion came bursting through. "You don't know anything about me," I shrieked wildly. "Gabriel broke my heart. It was bad enough that he reported me to management and blew the thing so out of proportion that it took me to court. But on top of it all, when I got there, he was sitting there, hanging all over that slut, rubbing her in my face, taunting me for having fallen for his flirtatious act, all while still having a girlfriend. It was all his fault." At my outburst, Locklear's eyes narrowed, and he brought his face closer to mine.
They were happy together, just living their lives, hurting no one. Good people. Innocent people. The type I worked so hard to protect. You were delusional. A sad, obsessed little girl who was jealous of a much prettier woman who happened to be dating the man you were stalking.
He hissed, every word dripping with venom that could kill. His words cut like a jagged knife. He just didn't understand me. No one understood me. It wasn't fair. "You don't know my side of the story," I wailed. "I didn't mean any harm. I didn't realize what I was doing was wrong. I was just trying to express my love."
Oh, of course. Just like you expressed your love to both Sam and Damien. My, you have quite the record of anti-stalking orders, Miss Winters. It would seem the way that you express your love is quite creepy.
Locklear chuckled in a cruel and ridiculing voice. "Don't you dare call me a stalker," I howled. "All I ever did was try and get to know them better. I was so in love, you don't understand. They blocked me without even understanding me, so I had to make new accounts to get through to them. They at least owed me an explanation as to why they left me alone. And if they didn't want to tell me, maybe they'd tell a stranger who wasn't involved in all of that. I thought I could smooth it all out. They were such dear friends, and then suddenly they were gone with no explanation. I was heartbroken."
Dear friends. My darling, you're delusional. You began stalking their social media accounts, and they tolerated you at best. It's all there in the court records, dearie. That's a very strange definition of dear friends, and that's coming from a genuine sociopath.
Locklear hissed, boring into me with his icy, unforgiving eyes. "But I wasn't stalking them!" I nearly screamed in a mixture of hurt and anger. "Why do people keep saying that? I just wanted to learn more about them. I loved them so much. I needed to learn the things they liked, who their friends and family were, and where they lived if I ever wanted a chance of making them love me back. It's not my fault they rejected my love."
Of course. Poor, innocent little lamb.
A wicked grin peeled across his face as he pulled the large, overhanging light down over me, turning it on, practically blinding me with the piercing light.
The truly sad thing, though, is if you had just been able to control your selfish rage of not getting your way, you wouldn't be here right now. Sure, you'd still be a rancid piece of trash rotting out in the city, but you'd be off my radar. Hell, had you not conned your way out of your last restraining order hearing, perhaps you'd just be spending a few nights downtown rather than preparing to face your maker.
Conned my way out? I huffed through my tears, beyond offended at this point.
Oh yes, my dear. It seems that over the years, you've gotten better at covering up your tracks. You keep your nefarious deeds online only, erased your footprints along the way. I suppose working in a tech department taught you some tricks. Combining that with the crotchety old judge that oversaw the case, not understanding or caring about online matters, and that ever so pitiful act you put up. The stars aligned for you to slip away like the snake you are.
I never put up an act, I screamed.
Oh, please. When you've seen as many court records as me, you know all the tricks. Who, me? Just a simple-minded, pitiful little woman. Even if I wanted to do those things, I wouldn't know how. He's just picking on me because he's popular and I'm homely and an easy target. Oh, boo-hoo-hoo. Paired with a sympathetic enough judge, the justice system will fail every time.
Something in me snapped. I couldn't restrain it any longer. You know what? Fine. I admit that I killed that bitch. I knew Gabriel was going to be out of town for a work conference and she would be there alone. But it wasn't wrong. Why should she get everything I ever wanted when I've tried so hard for years? Just because she's prettier than me? How is that fair? She ruined everything. If she hadn't been around, Gabriel would have loved me back. She had to pay for what she did to me. What I did wasn't wrong.
I've had enough of your mouth. You disgust me.
Locklear spat, shoving a dirty rag in my mouth, almost causing me to gag.
I've encountered a great deal of the worst humanity has to offer. But the ones like you always bother me the most. You who are truly depraved but are so narcissistic that you've managed to convince yourself that everything you do is justified because you are always the victim. This absolute proclamation of innocence allows you to slip into society almost undetected, and the amount of damage you do to everyone around you is nearly irreparable. I may be a murderer, but the lives I snuff out serve not myself but others. I use my dark deeds not to destroy innocent lives, but to save and improve them. Think me hypocritical if you will, but at least I can sleep at night knowing that I'm better than you.
Locklear backed away from me after finishing his tirade. He seemed almost in a daze for a moment. I used this opportunity to spit out the filthy gag that silenced me. You may think I'm awful, I croaked, but I know you've encountered worse than me. Serial killers, rapists, child abusers. So why the hell does it seem like you are taking this so personally? Why me?
Perhaps.
Locklear started, a strange and frightening darkness spreading across his face.
I'm taking this a little harder than usual because you made this personal for me.
I stared at him in dumbfounded confusion.
Miss Stephanie Lopez was a very special girl. She came from an honest, hard-working family that sadly didn't have much in the way of money. Miss Lopez was born with a rare heart condition and with no money or resources to get the replacement that would save her. Her life would have been in the hands of our deeply flawed medical system. In short, she would have likely died before getting the heart that she needed, and society at large wouldn't have cared, because she and her family weren't important enough. But they were good people, and that's important to me.
He never took his unblinking gaze off of me while he continued to speak.
Doing what I do, I have contacts, and Miss Lopez's family happened to learn of said contacts and connect with them. And long story short, after finding an appropriate donor, I was able to perform the life-saving procedure on her and give her another chance to share her light with this dark world. A light which you, Miss Winter, so violently snuffed out. Suffice to say, this is very personal.
An intense darkness that I had never seen before washed over him. With a sense of evil purpose, he stormed over to a table filled with sharp devices and inspected the selection before picking one up. My blood chilled as he then approached me. In one final attempt to spare myself from what I knew was coming next, I shouted at him one last time. You don't have to do this. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't know who she was. I didn't know any of that. How could I? I can change, though. You can help me. I could learn to be just like you. After all, you and I are exactly alike. However, his response came much darker and colder than I had hoped for, and my heart dropped, knowing the horrors that were about to befall me. Raising a wicked-looking tool up near my right eyeball, he leaned in and whispered a final retort.
You're quite mistaken. You are nothing like me. And for that, I'm going to make sure you hurt.
Cut them down and make them holy. Forgiven on this ground solely. Bear no arms, I'll rip those from you. As a corpse, no more harm you.